Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Um,
Today we're tackling something that can be
yeah,
a bit tricky to navigate blame shifting,
yeah.
and especially how it affects autistic people.
Hmm.
I think this is something that a lot of our listeners may be dealing with personally, or maybe they know someone in their lives who's going through this,
Yeah.
or maybe they're just fascinated by the psychology of it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got some really great insights from Cheap ABA. It's a website all about, autism awareness and support.
Hmm.
And their article is going to be our kind of our guide today.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find really interesting about blame shifting
Mm-hmm.
is that it's not always this big dramatic thing. It can be
Okay.
so subtle
Yeah.
that it kind of flies under the radar, but the effect is still the same.
Right.
You end up feeling responsible for something that you really shouldn't.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Yeah.
What exactly is blame shifting when we say that word? What are we talking about?
So imagine you've got a coworker who's always pointing the finger when a project goes wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Right? They say things like, well, if you had been more organized, this wouldn't have happened.
Oh, yeah.
So they're basically deflecting responsibility,
Mm.
and they're twisting the situation to make you feel at fault even though you followed all the rules.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
Right, so that's blame shifting in action. They're trying to protect their ego
Right.
and maintain this sense of superiority, even if it means, undermining you.
Wow. That example just makes it so crystal clear.
Yeah.
And it's not just in the workplace, right? This can happen anywhere. Families, friendships, romantic relationships.
Oh, absolutely, anywhere.
Yeah.
Think about like a parent
Yeah.
who says something like, you're making me upset by reacting this way. They're totally ignoring their own actions that led to the situation in the first place.
Right.
And they're making you responsible for their emotions.
Oh, that's so manipulative.
It is.
It's making me think about all the times I've probably encountered this and didn't even realize it was happening.
Yeah, and that's why we're talking about it. The more we understand these dynamics, the better we can protect ourselves.
Yeah, for sure.
But here's the thing. Blame shifting isn't just something that people with narcissistic personality disorder do.
Right.
We all do it to some extent,
Oh, yeah.
even unintentionally. Remember that time you were late and you blamed traffic?
Uh-huh.
When really you just hit snooze one too many times?
Oh, yeah, I've definitely been there.
Right, we all have. It's kind of human nature to try to, protect ourselves.
Yeah, I guess so.
But it becomes a problem when it's a constant pattern,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when it's directed at someone who's more susceptible to it.
Right.
And that brings us to the heart of today's deep dive.
Okay.
Why are autistic individuals especially vulnerable to this?
Yeah, that's what I'm really curious about.
So the article from Cheap ABA points out some key traits that, while they can be strengths in many ways, can unfortunately make autistic people more susceptible to this kind of manipulation.
Okay.
For example, think about someone who is incredibly empathetic and loyal.
Mm.
They genuinely care about others.
Right.
And they want to keep things harmonious.
Those are beautiful qualities.
They are.
Hard to see that as a bad thing.
Right. But those very traits can be taken advantage of by someone who's looking to shift blame.
Oh, I see.
So imagine someone who, takes things literally or maybe misses those subtle social cues.
Yeah.
They could easily be manipulated into believing they're at fault,
Right.
even when they're not.
Yeah. They might not pick up on the sarcasm or the, ulterior motives behind what someone's saying.
Exactly. And it's not just about misinterpreting words.
Okay.
Autistic individuals often communicate very directly and honestly, which can be misinterpreted as confrontational in some situations.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this can make it harder to defend themselves against accusations.
So if you're already struggling to decode those social cues and you're naturally inclined to be honest and straightforward, it's like this perfect storm where you're more likely to be blamed even if you did nothing wrong.
It's like you're playing a game where you don't know all the rules, and the other person is constantly changing them to their advantage.
That's a really good analogy.
And it makes me think about how sensory processing differences could also play a role here.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, think about it. If you're already feeling overwhelmed by sensory input,
Yeah.
and then someone starts bombarding you with accusations or intense emotions,
Right.
it's going to make it even harder to think clearly and stand up for yourself.
It's like your brain's already working overtime just to process what's going on around you.
Right.
And then boom, you get hit with this wave of, emotional stuff.
Exactly.
No wonder it can be so hard to respond in those moments.
And that's where understanding how these different aspects of autism kind of play together can be so helpful. It allows us to see how someone's strengths can actually be used against them in certain situations.
So we've talked about what blame shifting is.
Right.
And why autistic people might be more vulnerable to it.
Yeah.
But how do we actually recognize it happening, in our own lives?
That's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll be talking about in part 2.
I can't wait. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We're getting into the nitty-gritty now of how to actually spot blame shifting in action.
Yeah, and it can be really subtle.
Yeah, it feels like it could be happening everywhere and I'm just missing it.
Right, because it often disguises itself as something else.
Okay, so what should I be looking out for?
Well, think about those phrases that sound kind of innocent, like, I'm just worried about you, or maybe if you did things this way.
Yeah.
That sound helpful, right?
Yeah, they sound like advice.
Exactly.
Mm.
But underneath that, there's often an attempt to shift responsibility.
Okay.
So you really have to pay attention to that underlying message. Are they implying that you're the problem?
That's so sneaky.
It is.
And it's like they're making you question yourself without actually coming out and saying it.
Exactly. And remember those workplace examples we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
So let's say you've clearly outlined your role in a project, and then things go wrong.
Okay.
A blame shifter might say something like, well, I didn't know that was your responsibility.
Yeah.
Even though, it was clearly communicated.
It's like they're rewriting history.
Exactly.
To make themselves look better.
Exactly. And in families, it can sound like, you're so sensitive. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?
Ugh, yeah.
So they're turning the focus to your reaction instead of addressing their own behavior.
It's like they're trying to invalidate your feelings.
They are.
Make you feel like you're overreacting.
Exactly. And don't forget, online spaces can be a breeding ground for blame shifting.
Oh, yeah.
Think about all those, nasty comments you see on social media. Someone might leave a really hurtful message and then say, well, you shouldn't be so easily offended.
Right.
So they're making you responsible for their unkindness.
It's just making me realize now how often I see this, but I don't necessarily have the words to call it out. So how do we move from just recognizing it to actually resisting blame shifting?
Well, that's where empowerment comes in.
Okay.
And Cheap ABA has some great practical tips, but I want to build on those with some strategies specifically for autistic individuals.
Okay, cool.
So first and foremost, documentation can be your best friend.
Oh, you mean keeping a record of interactions, especially in work settings?
Exactly.
Cool.
So imagine you have a coworker who's always trying to shift blame. You keep a record of those emails, the meeting notes, anything that documents what happened.
Yeah.
This creates a paper trail that can protect you from, gaslighting or manipulation.
Okay.
And it also helps you to see those patterns that we were talking about.
It's like taking away their power to change the story.
Exactly. And documentation can be really powerful for setting boundaries too.
Okay.
So let's say you've clearly outlined your responsibilities and someone tries to, push back later.
Right.
You can just calmly refer to that documentation as a reminder of what was agreed upon.
It's like, nope, that's not on me. We already talked about this.
Exactly. Now, direct communication isn't always easy.
Right.
Especially for autistic individuals who might struggle with assertiveness. So think about practicing those conversations beforehand.
Oh, like role-playing with a friend or therapist?
Exactly. It's like rehearsing for a play.
Yeah.
The more you practice, the more confident you'll feel in those real-life situations.
Right.
You can even create scripts or use visual aids to communicate your boundaries more clearly.
That's a really good idea.
And speaking of support, the article mentions having allies.
Yes.
That's so important. Surround yourself with people who understand these dynamics and who can offer validation and guidance. It could be a therapist, a mentor, a supportive family member,
right,
or even an online community.
Right.
Having that outside perspective can really help you to see things more objectively.
Yeah.
And avoid self-blame.
It's like having a team in your corner.
Exactly.
To help you stay strong and focused.
Yeah. What about those situations where it's not possible to have that direct conversation or set those boundaries?
Oh, yeah.
What if you're dealing with someone who's chronically manipulative?
Right.
And they just refuse to take responsibility?
That's a tough one.
It is. And that's where self-preservation becomes so important.
Okay.
You don't have to engage in every battle.
Right.
Sometimes the healthiest choice is to just walk away.
That's hard, though, isn't it? Especially if it's someone you care about.
It is tough, but you have to prioritize your own well-being.
Right.
And Cheap ABA specifically says that autistic individuals might be targeted for their empathy and their willingness to help.
Right.
So it's really important to recognize when that compassion is being exploited and to give yourself permission to step back.
It's like reminding yourself that it's okay to say no.
Exactly.
And to protect yourself.
And that brings us back to self-care.
Yeah.
This is something we touched on earlier, but is worth emphasizing. Dealing with blame shifting can be incredibly draining.
So what kind of self-care strategies would you recommend?
Think about anything that helps you to recharge and to regulate your emotions. It could be spending time in nature, listening to music, engaging in a special interest, or practicing mindfulness.
Okay.
It's also important to seek professional support
Yeah.
from a therapist who understands autism and the challenges you're facing.
It's like giving yourself permission to prioritize your own well-being.
Yeah.
It's not selfish.
It's essential.
It's essential for building that resilience.
It is. And remember, building resilience is an ongoing process. It's not about becoming immune to blame shifting, but it's about developing those tools and strategies that work for you.
Okay.
So you can navigate those situations with more confidence.
This is so empowering. I feel like we're really building this toolkit.
Yeah.
For self-advocacy, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
What are some key takeaways you want listeners to remember as we head into the final part of our conversation?
You don't have to accept blame that isn't yours.
Yeah.
Understanding these tactics is a huge step towards advocating for yourself and creating healthier relationships.
Yeah.
We're going to delve even deeper into that in part 3.
Awesome. I can't wait. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking about, recognizing blame shifting and resisting it.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling so much more equipped to deal with these situations now.
Good.
But it makes me wonder, how does understanding all of this really change things, in the bigger picture?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really exciting.
Okay.
It's not just about individual empowerment.
Yeah.
It's about creating a more inclusive and understanding world for everyone.
Okay, I'm listening.
So for me, it starts with awareness. The more we understand about these subtle dynamics of blame shifting, the better we are at spotting it, not just in our own lives, but also in those larger systems and structures.
Oh, you mean societal norms or institutional policies?
Exactly. Think about how autistic individuals are often unfairly blamed.
Yeah.
For communication differences or social challenges.
Right.
This happens in schools, workplaces, even within families.
It's like they're being held to a standard that doesn't even apply to them.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't take into account their strengths.
It doesn't. And when we understand how blame shifting works, we can start to challenge those harmful narratives.
Okay.
So instead of saying you need to fit in, we can advocate for environments that, celebrate neurodiversity. And accommodate different ways of being.
It's like shifting the focus from fixing the individual to changing the system.
Exactly. And it's not just about advocating for policy changes.
Okay.
It's about changing how we interact with each other every day.
So how can we apply this understanding in our own relationships and communities?
Well, it starts with cultivating empathy and curiosity. So instead of immediately judging someone who's shifting blame, ask yourself, what might be driving this behavior?
Okay.
What unmet needs might be at play here?
That's such a good point.
It's not about condoning the behavior.
Right.
But it does open up space for understanding.
And that understanding can lead to better conversations.
Absolutely.
And solutions.
Imagine a workplace.
Yeah.
Where people feel safe to talk about blame shifting, openly, without fear of retribution.
That would be incredible.
Right. Instead of everyone feeling defensive and pointing fingers, they could actually work together to address the real issues.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about.
Yeah.
Giving you the knowledge and the tools to recognize these patterns, to protect yourself, and to advocate for a world where empathy and understanding are just the norm.
Beautifully said.
It's not just about individual resilience. It's about our collective responsibility to create a more just and equitable world.
For everyone.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much things I can apply in my own life and also share with others.
Remember, knowledge is power. But true empowerment comes from actually using that knowledge.
Yeah.
So keep asking those questions.
Okay.
Keep challenging the status quo.
Yeah.
And keep advocating for a world that celebrates neurodiversity.
Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.